All right, friends, if you head over to ESPN.com, it's probably a byline you've seen by our guest here, which is Eli Lederman. He's done a lot of work in the college football space, covers some college softball, and he's all over the place on ESPN.com. But luckily, he was able to carve out some time for us here on the Sons of UCF. So, Eli, first off, I know you're busy. I know there's a ton of stuff going on, man. Definitely appreciate you hopping in and joining us here on the Sons of UCF.
Well, I appreciate you having me, and it's a blast getting to do this finally. I know we've been trying to do it for a while, and I'm excited to come on and talk some UCF, talk some college football. It's all upon us. It's here sooner. Every year it feels like it gets here sooner than the year before it.
Absolutely. Well, here's where the pleasantries stop, though, Eli, because we in Night Nation are raving mad because you were part of a group that looked at all the Power Four schools, I guess, and sort of ranked them by conference, and you contributed to the article that had our beloved UCF Knights ranked last in the Big 12. I kid when I say we're upset about that because obviously I think Knight fans understand this is a tough task ahead of new coach Scott Frost. But curious, kind of in your analysis and your reporting, and the work that you and the group did, what kind of stood out to you for UCF? And as you kind of analyze them, how did you kind of get to the spot where you feel like they're probably one of the bottom teams of the Big 12?
Well, and that was among certainly the more friendly responses we got from the folks we that were not where fan bases wanted them. But it's worth clarifying. We were evaluating the off seasons for every team, and so it wasn't necessarily a projection of what we think the fall is going to look like, but how the off seasons went. When you look at UCF's off season, I think there's positives. One being Scott Frost returning to UCF, and I know we're going to talk about that and some of the dynamics there. But you look at losing a head coach and what happened after it. 34, I think, scholarship players leave the roster, down 11 starters, down a senior class. And there's some intriguing guys that were brought in, but it's not as though they lost 34 and replaced those 34 with a really intriguing portal class or anything like that. And so I think it's really the unknowns with UCF that maybe as we were sitting down and having those conversations and trying to figure out, it was not a perfect formula of how do you weigh, who has a good transfer class versus who held on to their guys or who made good staff ads. But on the whole, with UCF, I think it's everything that makes them so exciting or potentially exciting, which is the unknown, is everything that went into that of, it was hard to evaluate their offseason next to everybody else in the conference and say that, they didn't take certainly maybe talent-wise a step back. And then again, those unknowns, we know there's new coaches on the staff, kind of getting the band back together with Mackenzie Milton. Alex Grinch is really exciting, but all those unknowns on top of all that roster turnover, I think is sort of what put them there. But, I don't know if that necessarily indicates much of anything. And this, whether it's ESPN or someone on TV, none of us know nothing until they start playing games in September.
And to be fair to you, I should point out that you all authored that piece in the middle of May. So by the time you and I are talking now, it's about a month old. UCF's actually lost more. I think it's 60 some odd new players.
Mm-hmm.
Frost told us last week in a press availability. So to your point, a ton of turnover. You said something that I think UCF fans probably, if they're driving, pulled their car to the side of the road. You used the word Alex Grinch and exciting in the same sentence. I think a lot of UCF fans are kind of lukewarm about Grinch as the defensive coordinator. He's had a tough run at Oklahoma and flamed out at USC. What do you like about Alex Grinch? Why do you think that's an exciting hire for UCF's defense?
Well, it's a fair point, and I'm based in Oklahoma City. I used to cover Oklahoma before I was at ESPN, so I know um, that Alex Grinch well. I would followed along from afar when he was in Los Angeles, and yeah, there's a lot there that probably doesn't jump off the page, but you got to consider the fact that Lincoln Riley worked with this guy for nearly a decade and thought highly enough of him to bring him to LA, and it didn't go great at Southern California. They had a lot to fix there these last couple of years. And maybe like a lot of other things about this team right now and this program right now, it's a gamble. There's no doubt about that. But I think if in 3 years or 2.5 years or whatever, maybe even 1 year, we're talking about UCF and them being one of the big surprises of one of these next few college football seasons and knocking on the door of the playoff because they've gotten it all right. Part of that is Alex Grinch realizing some of that potential that flashed along the way when he was at Oklahoma and at USC, and that if we view it as a drop down from perhaps, college football playoff contending program in Oklahoma and USC, which was shooting for that and doing it certainly in last year in a much tougher conference, although he wasn't there at that point. You're talking about an opportunity. And I think that's what everything right now, from where I sit, with UCF is they're making a gamble just like every other program kind of at this level of, what's our best formula to be that team, to be Arizona State at some point. And I think Alex Grinch can be part of that formula, but I do get as well if there's reticence within the fan base because there's plenty to point to the contrary on that front.
Well, yeah, let's stay on Grinch for a second. I wasn't planning on going here, but while we're here, since obviously you spent time in Oklahoma, where did things go wrong? Like how did, for a while he was a Broyles Award winner, I believe, at some points in his career, right? He was considered one of the up and coming coaches. Not sure if his name was really out there in head coaching circles, but I'm sure there are a group of 5 teams who maybe kicked the tires. How did we get from Broyles Award finalist Alex Grinch to we're talking about him as a fan base now? We don't think he can be a coordinator. How did that happen? How did that decline happen?
Yeah, I mean, some of it, I think certainly like tail end of Oklahoma, you think about those teams that they had at the very front end of the Lincoln Riley era, your teams led by Baker Mayfield, Kyler Murray. A lot of this was on offense, but the talent was really high, like sky high on those teams. I don't know the next time we're going to see an Oklahoma team that has a CD Lamb with a Baker Mayfield and so on. Of course, not all that was on defense, but I think there was a steady decline at Oklahoma in the recruiting in those final years under Lincoln Riley, and certainly on the defensive side of the football. And then, USC, I don't think a lot changed on that front. So personnel wise, I think his defenses have kind of tailed off. And of course, if you're the coordinator and it's your defense that, isn't recruiting, that's a reflection of you in there. But I think just little things, and maybe a generous view is sort of caught in the storm of, if things were going south in Norman and it's taken a few years to get the dust to settle at USC, that he was kind of swept up in that. But, where did it go wrong? His defense is stop getting stops, stop making tackles. And that all sounds really simple. But that is kind of what bore out over those years where that promise that we saw sort of faded and at least has him in a spot to where, it's either a redemption arc or it'll be another, maybe what a lot of people have projected around those parts of, something that's not going to work out.
I think a lot of people were surprised, Eli, when Gus Malzahn left UCF to go to Florida State as a coordinator. But they were even more surprised when Terry Mohajir hires in Scott Frost, obviously, who had been at UCF, had some great success there, and things just didn't work out at Nebraska. When you heard the news or learned that Scott Frost was getting back in the coaching game, coming back to UCF, what were your thoughts? What are your thoughts on that as a hire for the Knights?
Well, and this is where you can guide me on all the more local politics around, Scott Frost and the feelings about. I'm really curious, sort of, even for your piece on that. But for one, it's a Terry Mohajir hire. I covered him at Arkansas State. Not only has he hired well historically, but he likes a flashy, exciting hire. And from where I sit, I don't know how you can do much better than bringing back Scott Frost, the guy who when he left was on a trajectory everyone thought to be one of college football's greatest coaches at the time. And I think where I'll probably return to in a lot of ways with UCF and where it's at right now is everybody who is in Georgia, Alabama, Ohio State, or in a spot right now to really go compete at the top level financially, talent-wise, all that, is figuring out what is the right gamble for us to make to be that Arizona State. I know I've mentioned that already, but to be the team that in whether it's a given year or ideally sustaining it can skyrocket because of what we have going on here. And that might be coaching staff, that might be an influx of local talent, that may be the unique factors of where the school's situated. There's a lot about UCF that makes it unique that I think can be capitalized on for success there. All that needs to go right at this point for a school like UCF to break through. And so if you ask me, bringing back a guy who I don't even think, given the state of the roster, I think it was probably in a tougher spot when Scott Frost got back here the first time. And so I think he is somebody who's proven he can do it at Central Florida, a different time in college football, of course. But I think, again, you could have seen Terry Mohajir go hire the next hot group of 5 coordinator or head coach. And we've seen how that can go one way or the other. There's a lot of different archetypes you can hire. There's none more dreamy than the, second stint for a program legend. And I think, if you are betting on who could pull UCF to the heights it wants to reach, Scott Frost, to me, with the local ties, with the history there, feels as good a bet as any. But just like any other hire, it's a gamble.
Yeah, I think to answer your question, I think this is the ultimate sort of convergence of head and heart, right? I think the heart of UCF fan says, here's the guy who was here, got us to great success, brought in a new exciting offense, kind of got UCF back on the map. A lot of people would tell you without that 17 season, maybe UCF doesn't get a Big 12 invite, right? So Scott Frost has favored status just of what he did on the field and what he produced here for UCF, right? So the heart is there saying our beloved son, air quotes, is coming back home. The head then kicks in and goes, 16-31 at Nebraska, 5-22 in one-score games, a completely gutted roster, wasn't dealing with NIL before, had some stuff maybe at Nebraska that wasn't wonderful. And so it's the ultimate head-heart argument. I think there's a lot of UCF fans who want to lead with their heart on this and say, he's back, great, look at this, and we're gonna do 2017 all over again. But I think the head kicks in and you go, oh, wait a minute, this is 8 years later. This is not the same college landscape. This isn't even the same conference UCF was in. A lot has changed in those 8 years.
Well, and it's where, as much as any other coach across the country, this is now on Scott Frost's shoulders to either prove folks right, prove them wrong. But I'd also look beyond that in terms of what will the setup be around him? What kind of investment is there? And that is where Terry Mohajir comes in, where perhaps the unique resources in and around UCF come into play. Because if managing NIL on a roster was something that Scott Frost struggled with at Nebraska, you can hire someone to do that. And you can reinforce a front office staff around that. Now, that's easier said than done. It's easier done in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and Athens, Georgia, than it is at many other programs in terms of the resources and being able to have that big enough of a staff. But it is where the commitment, and I don't know that anybody at this point is going to succeed in any job, no matter how great they are, without the commitment around them, that if that shows up around Scott Frost and he can channel all the best stuff that he was doing, before things went south and in Lincoln, or if they ever really were headed upward, I don't know. But point being that I think it is as much about where he's at and what he can do in this job as it is what's around him in the personnel space and in terms of resources.
We're about 12 minutes into this interview, and I've learned two things about you already that I did not know coming into this. So terrible research on my part. But you covered Terry Mohajir. I certainly would love your perspective on Terry Mohajir. He's one, and I'll be candid with you, Eli. I think he's maligned in the UCF fan base, right? I think there's some decisions he's made that people kind of understand and see. I think there's some things that he's done that have people scratching their heads, i.e. a Scott Frost hire, right? There's mixed results on that. In your experience, how would you describe Terry Mohajir? How would you describe him as an AD and in your time covering him and what you kind of experienced at Arkansas State?
Yeah, so I was around him at Arkansas State. I was there when he left a handful of years ago now, but it was he put Arkansas State on the map, or helped put them on the map, by being the guy who could hire the coach. And Arkansas State became that destination for a handful of years of kind of one and done or two and done coaches who would come to Arkansas State, succeed, and leave. I mean, that was Hugh Freeze. It was it was Gus at a certain point in time, Brian Harsin, all of them springboard from there. And so he kind of gained a reputation for being able to hire and succeeding in a place that wasn't, preordained. Winning in the Sun Belt, winning in Jonesboro, Arkansas is not preordained. And I think then his personality, and that's what made him an attractive, Terry Mohajir, an attractive AD hire for a program like UCF. But I do think, that maybe you guys have experienced it, and it sounds like sort of the vibe there is uncertain. Is sometimes those big swings are great, and other times they're exciting on the day you have the press conference, and from there it descends. And we're going to find out, certainly with Scott Frost. That's probably the most important hire Terry Mohajir's made since arriving on campus. And without knowing all the details there, it could be one that, not only defines the next era of UCF football, but Terry Mohajir's tenure at UCF. And so that's the question. But I think he's the guy, Terry Mohajir, to me, that if you got to take a gamble at this point. I know I've returned to that a few times now, but if you are in a spot like where UCF is, you need someone who's going to do things differently. I think if you're going to get there, and that can go a lot of different ways. But I think he's got that sort of enthusiasm. He generates that excitement and is sort of that out there athletic director at Arkansas State. He was known for doing push-ups after touchdowns. Like he was a mascot on the board. And I don't know if that has popped up there. And that stuff is great when things are good and wears thin when they're not. And so that's where, the results are what's going to matter. But I think that enthusiasm is certainly one of his big selling points. But again, that is only great when things are good.
Yeah, I mean, I look, the Scott Frost, if it does not work out, that will be his last hire, right? Terry Mohajir will not hire another football coach if Scott Frost doesn't work out. That's just my opinion, of course. But obviously losing, not hitting on Gus if you fail on Scott Frost, I don't know many ADs who get 2 bad football hires and survive to make
Right.
the third hire. And it's interesting you talk about the enthusiasm. I think there's an element of the rah nature that fans love, but there's also kind of an element of you're the top seat, you're the top voice in the athletic department. There's kind of a certain way to go about doing that. So I think Terry's a little bit maligned, but you said it earlier. If UCF was not 4-8 last year, but was 8-4, 9-3, we're bowl eligible and going to maybe a bigger bowl game, perhaps. Some of these conversations are taking place. I want to get back to the staff. You mentioned obviously Scott Frost bringing in a staff. We talked about Alex Grinch, obviously Mackenzie Milton, first time a quarterback coach. Sean Clark, a former offensive line coach who ascended to head coach, now back at UCF as an O-line coach. What do you make of kind of the staff he's assembled? I know you kind of talk in the article about some notable names being on that staff and maybe helping Frost. What do you kind of make of the staff that he's pulled together?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned those names that kind of jump off the page. It's Grinch because of where he's been. It's Sean Clark because of what he's gone and done. And Mackenzie Milton, again, if you're having your dream redemption arc here, like it doesn't get better than Mackenzie Milton, who for the past few years has been sort of viewed as some kind of a rising star in this coaching space, this personnel space. Getting that all back together, that's a part of this. I mean, if the vision is that they're going to establish something real and lasting, and to be able to recruit the overwhelming local talent at a different kind of level and bring guys in, that's going to start with this staff, and it's going to start as well again with the program support and what kind of resources they have, but it's going to start there. And I think if you're trying to sell local kids and convince them once again that UCF is where they have to be and it's the place for them to be, or if it's going back in the portal, I know programs like UCF, oftentimes if they miss on a kid in high school, they're waiting for that kid from the greater Orlando area to spend a year somewhere else, hit the portal, and then come home. That starts with your coaching staff. And so that's where it starts with Scott Frost, but on down. And I think having some high profile guys who have done it, are going to be a big part of that. And so, can Alex Grinch leverage the pieces of his past and where he's been on the positive end, and hope maybe folks aren't fixated as many UCF fans probably are on some of the down parts with Oklahoma and USC. That's a win. Sean Clark has done the job, and we all know, and again, wherever Scott Frost maybe struggled, having other former head coaches on the staff, that's a benefit, and we know that's going to help a team. And I mean, even if it's personal, I've spoken with Mackenzie over the years, covered Dylan Gabriel at Oklahoma, and that was a window into Mackenzie. Excited for him to see what he can bring in kind of this first really major job. And so that's where, you could, if you're a college football fan, your program could, there's a lot of different ways to build a program when you've got a new head coach. And if I were a UCF fan, I think my excitement would lie in sort of the people they brought in around Scott Frost as much as him.
I want to talk broader Big 12, obviously. And you mentioned Oklahoma a few times, and I think it's an interesting question. How do you think the Big 12 has kind of repositioned itself with the departure of Oklahoma and Texas? Obviously, they were the two kind of bell cow schools, if you will, in the Big 12, losing those schools to the SEC. How do you think this Big 12 and Brett Yormark has kind of repositioned the new Big 12 with the schools that are there?
Yeah, I mean, I remember like summer 2021 and the feeling that like the Big 12 was about to die on the vine. And so in that sense, Brett Yormark has come in and done a remarkable job of retooling the conference, reconfiguring its financial setup, putting it in a position to basically, if we, I don't know if Brett would acknowledge it this way, but I'm sure, in his deepest thoughts would understand this, is that like, if we agree the Big Ten and the SEC have just run away from everybody else, being that next best thing and being positioned financially and from an entertainment standpoint and a legacy program standpoint to remain in an exciting conference. And from that spot at this point, less than 5 years ago, where we thought the Big 12 might be, on its last legs, they've done a remarkable job. And from a neutral perspective, myself, I don't know if there's a more fun conference in college football than the Big 12, because every single weekend you've got games and that are difficult to predict. And, I think last year we saw bits and pieces of it. We could be headed for it again this year of having, 6-7 teams in conference and playoff contention at the end of a season, just because of how tightly packed it is. And in that sense, I think it's fun. I think, part of that, if they can swipe any of that, Pac-12 after dark or Pac-10 after dark energy that you tend to get from these crazy Big 12 games, and always have, but I think new blood, new programs, the right new programs have transformed kind of what they can be. And it may never reach the heights of the Big Ten and the SEC. And we don't know where the sport's going to go in terms of playoff expansion and locking out to some degree, teams outside of those two leagues. But as far as I'm concerned, the Big 12 is as fun as it gets. And I think people who are fixated on those two other conferences in particular are missing out on a whole lot in the Big 12.
What do you consider the cream of the crop football wise for the Big 12? You mentioned it. I'm not going to hold you to this because last year
Mm-hmm.
I did that. You would have had the exact reverse order of the coaches poll, right? With
That's right.
winning the conference. But who are you mentioned 4, 5, 6 schools that you think could kind of be in that mix there? Who do you consider the cream of the crop as we get closer to the 25 football season?
I think Arizona State, they're going to have to reconfigure a bit, not having Cam Scatterbo, but I think Sam Levitt may be the best quarterback in the conference, unless I'm just forgetting somebody off the top of my head. And they're bringing back a lot, and we're going to see if they can replicate it. But past that, Iowa State, they had a lot to replace at receiver, but they went and made some moves. Kansas State, I think the expectations are really high, and it's not just about Avery Johnson, what they have on offense. I think they feel really good about the defense they have there. And I think, folks like Baylor, people really like Sawyer Robertson. And that is where, to your point on last year, we could have sat here in the conversation we would have had last June. We probably would have looked pretty silly.
Yeah.
And it's part of the fun of the league. But I think once you get past maybe that top tier on paper, or if anything, we're probably judging too much off of the 2024 season. There's so many fascinating teams that I think could pop up and surprise us or disappoint us. I mean, staying in Oklahoma State, in a similar sense of UCF, and I don't know where we had them in our, off the top of my head, in our conference offseason rankings, but I think that was another program where we said they lost a ton and they added a ton. How on earth do you really judge what they're going to be or what kind of offense offseason they had? And so there's a handful of teams like that, UCF, Oklahoma State, that have really drastically changed things. And we may see examples of that blowing up completely in the wrong direction, or someone who really surprises us. I mean, this time last year, we were not talking about Arizona State, and they emerged. So I think that's, again, part of, if I were in the Big 12 office, I'd be leaning into that as part of our brand value, is that we are the place for the unexpected and the fun and the chaotic in terms of football. And I think we're in for it again in 2025.
Oklahoma State was 12 in that ranking. What do you make, Eli, of what Texas Tech has done? They've been very active in the portal. They're not shy about the Matador Club and what they've been able to offer from an NAL perspective. We've seen it play out just recently in the softball diamond with Najee Kennedy. What do you make about of what Texas Tech has done in the football space, particularly, but across all sports? I mean, oil money stays undefeated. Eli, what do you make of what Texas Tech has done?
Indeed, it does. And I knew as I was talking about the cream of the crop, I was like, I'm forgetting. There's a name, an obvious one that I'm forgetting. And then you said Texas Tech, and I knew that's what I was forgetting. But fact is, they are going to be as great an example, I think, of that chaotic offseason as you can find of where it can go. This may go great. They may be knocking on the door of the playoff later this year. Total ROI, all that. It may look a lot like softball, but we also have seen programs that go heavy on the portal and spend a lot of money and have a season like Florida State did a year ago. And so I think there's nothing guaranteed other than that. They have certainly retooled in a big way, spent a lot of money on it, and garnered a lot of attention around that. But that is not going to matter, in October, November, when we hit the business end of that conference schedule. And I think they're going to be good. Yeah, there's no doubt about that. I don't necessarily forecast a Florida State kind of season, but I think getting ahead of your boots on they're going to be 10, 11 wins and, pushing on even those bye spots in the playoff. I'm not there yet either. And I think every other program in the country in a broader sense would like their gamble to be spending the kind of money that Texas Tech has spent and doing it so openly and all that. But, and that's surely, if there's no guaranteed way of succeeding in college football, having a lot of money is the best way to start. But I think, no different. I mean it from where UCF is, where a lot of other programs are. I think if you're going to succeed in college football in this day and age, and you're not one of those 15 to 20 just over-resourced blue blood programs, you've got to figure out your best path to winning. And I think that's where, Texas Tech right now, their best path appears to be, the Matador Club and all the money they've got going. But we're going to find out if that works. And there's other places they're going to have to do things differently. And I don't know that money is going to guarantee success, or at least long-term success. And I think that's going to be an interesting piece to see. and they are going to absolutely be at the forefront of it, whether it's in softball or college football. Of their spending, and we know how it worked in softball this year. I was uh, on the day Najee Kennedy committed to Texas Tech, and I was in Oklahoma City the night they lost Game 3 against Texas, and we know they're going to be back, and they've already made some big moves in the portal, but uh, it's going to translate to football too. But we're going to see if it can be gamed that way financially, the way it has been in maybe some other sports.
Let's talk a little college football playoff. At the Big 12 spring meetings, Brett Yarmark was adamant that himself and his coaches all voted that they wanted the 5+11 concept, right? Which essentially is, the 5 AQs and 11 at large. However, the SEC and the Big Ten have been kind of floating this 4+4+2+2+2+1, whatever. That model would guarantee a Big 12 team 2 entrants into the college football playoff. Brett Yormark seems to favor the 5-11, which may or may not guarantee his team anything outside of 1. What do you make of the Big 12 stance on the 5-11 versus maybe taking the 2 guaranteed spots and the proposed SEC kind of Big 10 model?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there's parts of that that are strategic and other parts that are political. Of even if, let's say hypothetically, that other scenario, the 4 plus a million one ones and twos,
Yeah.
if that was advantageous, there still would be a reason for the Big 12 and the ACC not to just give in to the Big 10 SEC, power dynamic alone. But I think, there's a viewpoint that says, well, particularly in a league where we agree that in a given year, there might be 4, 5, 6, whether they're playoff worthy teams, but teams that are going to be pushing at the end of the season in the Big 12. Why limit yourself to those 2 while handing over the power to these conferences that financially and in terms of their hold of the power do kind of have it all in their hands, but with what little power you do have holding on to it. But I think, my broader feeling on all this playoff expansion stuff is sort of at risk of just sort of, whether it's alienating fan bases in a given conference or elevating certain conferences above of one another, but also just shifting the sport, a sport that already has so much constant movement, away from anything consistent and graspable, if that's a word, or for lack of a better word, for fans. I think every single year we spend the offseason discussing a new playoff format, an expanded format, all these different things. Right now, I mean, it's certainly entertaining, and probably entertaining to folks in places like the Big 12 office or other parts of the country, watching the infighting between the Big 10 and SEC, who, as long as they don't agree with each other, we're probably not going to get very far on anything. I think from, college football as a whole, all the change these last few years, how much of it has been catered to or with the thought of the fan and fan bases and programs outside of a certain sect. To me, that's a much bigger concern than overall what format we go with or what kind of qualifiers we have. Because I think if you're just switching this up every year, you can look up in 5 years and it's unrecognizable. And college football fans at large, we're never not going to have fans packing a stadium in Columbus, Ohio, but the interest in the sport could wane.
If you're like me, I'm sure you love getting your college football news out of courtrooms and
Yes,
injunctions and
exactly.
hearings and lawyers, but that's the reality. Unfortunately, these last couple of months, and some of that culminates with the House settlement now that has been, I guess, approved by Judge Wilkin, and goes into effect. I think there's some elements that go into effect here in early June, and some that kick in July. The cap, all that stuff, right? I think fans understand that, but it's a complex topic. There's a lot of machinations in and out of it. What is most interesting to you about this House settlement at large, and whatever is included in the bill that is or will become at some point the House settlement?
I think it's the question of how, in a landscape both where we've had Congress involved in this and federal judges, to major power players in college football, and everything, it seems, every turn, things landing in a courtroom, how enforcement is going to work here. And I know there's all the talk about the clearinghouse and fair market value and all that stuff. I don't think it's really a question of when we're going to see this pop up again in court or be challenged that way. It's not a question of how our schools, programs, um, athletes, coaches going to work to get around the new rules. I mean, they've spent these programs and program leaders have spent the better part of a couple of years trying to orchestrate all these rules. Think about the money that was spent to do that. And at the very same time, on their own campuses, you've got programs figuring out how do we get around those rules. And I think whether it's a legal element or just what this new enforcement body can really do realistically, even if they identify something as being against the rules, what are they going to do about it? That's the piece that I think is going to drive these next handful of years of college football until we get to some form of a permanent solution, which I think in college athletics we're probably not headed toward at any point anytime soon. So I think to me it's where does this go in the real world? We can sit here and talk about how great putting a anything over $600,000 goes to a Deloitte clearinghouse. On paper, sure. What's that going to look like when a quarterback X at school Y um, receives that kind of deal and either goes to court over it or there's enforcement around it? To me, that's what's interesting because it's what's really going to matter.
I don't want to put you in the spot here, and if you don't know this, that's fine. I just one thing I'm struggling with is what is the College Sports Commission? What is that? What does that entity do? What does that arm do? Do they have enforceable powers? Do you have any insight on what that College Sports Commission is and what value of power they have over the college landscape?
Well, the short answer is no, and I don't know that a lot of people do. And I think that's part again of what makes all this so interesting is it's a net positive. I think now that House, whatever the outcomes are going to be from it and how it's going to play out, the positive of it being done and approved and on its way is that we're at least to some degree about to get out of the abyss where I think people spent months, programs spent months not being sure of what was going to come next. And a lot is still uncertain, but at least we know that House is going to go through. It's been approved. But programs have spent the last year and a half in flux. And you could call 10 different programs in a different day, and you get 10 different answers on things like the commission, like on how will things be enforced, on how will collectives work in this new era. And it's yet another example of this commission of wait and see. And not a single program, I don't think, across the country has their finger on exactly the pulse of where we're headed. And so, again, the answer to that question is no. And it's one of the very open questions of what this next year is going to look like.
I'm curious. I know you cover sports that not just football, right? I think a lot of people think about this $20.5 million cap just in the football perspective, but obviously it's across all sports. What do you think the House impact has on sports outside of football, right? And you think about softball, which is a sport I know you cover, a sport that UCF has had some success in lately, right? How do you think that the House impacts non-football sports in the college landscape?
I think there's some that can really benefit here. Obviously, not every school athletic department is going to be using the full extent of that 20.5 million or getting to that point. But many will. But if you're a program that is on the right program on the right campus, if you are UCF softball and that's either a potential moneymaker, a school program where the school is successful, or a place where they want to be successful, that can really be a springboard now. If the resources are there, and we know in softball that at least in the case of Texas Tech this past year, you put money behind it, you can get good fast. You can't do that everywhere. And so I do think you'll see certain programs catapult, and this will help, basketball schools where they don't have a football program. I think you look at the Big East or whatever makes up the new and old Big East schools, but you're St. John's or Villanova, you're saying, well, if we can get to 5, 6, 7, 8 million and we don't have to worry about a football program like they do at Alabama, that's pretty good. But I think where you're going to see the real ripples, and unfortunately, it's probably the stories that aren't going to be told widely enough, are your smaller programs at major universities or smaller schools at the Division I level or elsewhere that just realize that they can't keep doing it. So you're going to see a rowing program, a women's gymnastics program, for example, I think on campuses across the country that either get effectively relegated in terms of what resources come their way or shut down entirely. And I think that's the kind of stuff that there's people doing really good work in my end of the industry of journalism, diving into that stuff. But that's probably the stuff that we don't quite have the full picture of yet. And again, those stories that probably won't be quite as widely told either.
Do you have any sense in talking to people in and around college athletics, what that split may look like? We've heard a lot of people talk about 75 to football, maybe 15 to men's basketball, and divvy that up. Have you had any sense, any ADs or any folks kind of talk to you about maybe what the plans or what schools are planning for, just in terms of how they may split up that 20.5 if they obviously fund that full amount?
Yeah, it's been interesting to hear some ADs in the last week and a half start to reveal a bit about where they see the money going, and often very unspecifically. We have heard, certain ones have said 75% to football and different percentages, but I think it's noteworthy and not suspicious, but noteworthy to hear mostly vague accounts of where things are going to go. But that's also where the question comes in of what did Ohio State spend on its football roster a year ago? What does it need to spend on it now? And how much of that can come from the outside? And it's where collectives are still going to have a place. I mean, I can say probably to this point, some of the numbers people maybe have seen out there about what, a major football program's roster costs in a given season are high. I don't think to date anybody has spent $40 million on college football roster, but we're heading there. And I don't think, something more in the range of 25 to 30 million, even in this coming season, is very far off. And so that is more, of course, than that salary cap or that revenue share cap. And that is where collectives are going to come into play. And the biggest programs in the country may wind up spending as much, if not more, through their collectives as they do through revenue sharing. So a major football program, if it is the full 20%, 20 million on rev share, and you give 75% of that, that's $15 million. I don't think that your very biggest programs at the top of the sport are going to be competing with that kind of money. And so it's where collectives will come in. And it's also where that previous discussion around what can collectives or outside people do and, within the framework, so how it will be enforced. I think that's going to be the key piece there and where you're going to see that money getting spent and then the trickle downs to other sports around it.
I think a lot of fans are skeptical or assume that the McDonald's bag man may come back, right? And some of the stuff that was happening allegedly all these years,
right?
The table, that it's almost like cheating is going to be back again, right? Like it's going to have a reinvention.
Oh, it's never gone away, not in college athletics. But I do think as nuts as all this is, the last 5 years have been, now there's more framework around it. It is at least somewhat above the table now, and we're all seeing it. And maybe that is certainly jarring. And the horror stories the last few years around NIL recruiting, all that stuff. But at least I think we're seeing more of it now, although there's still plenty that's going on underneath the table.
All right, I'll get you out here on this one. I'm curious your order on this. I'm going to give you 4 things that I want you to rank in terms of what it takes to be successful in college athletics right now. So of these 4 things: recruiting, facilities, money, and coaching. Of those 4 things, what's the most important thing? What would your order be of those 4 things that are needed to be most successful right now in college athletics?
Great question. I probably would. I guess I'll go back to front. Facilities are huge and they're important. And, I'm in Los Angeles right now as we speak. I was at USC the other day. They're building a brand new, sparkling facility. We've probably gotten slightly away from that arms race. I think in like the 2010s, I'm sure, ESPN and other outlets wrote 15 stories about the new School X facility with a water slide and the barbershop inside. And those
Clemson that you go down.
Yeah,
sure.
Precisely. The bells and whistles used to be the thing. They still matter, but either every school has them, or as importantly, every school, while they are still building, has realized they need that money for other things now, namely revenue sharing and paying their athletes. But they're still getting built. But I think team schools are moving away slightly from those, but they matter. But I think when you maybe hit a certain point, the returns are diminishing. But I think that's there. It feels crazy to say coaching's third, because I think we watch 12, 13, 14 games every fall, 14 weeks of football every fall, and we see how important coaching is. But having the players matters a whole lot. And so I'll say money number 2, because it is what matters most, but it only matters if you're recruiting well with that money. And so it's where recruiting number 1, either if you have an empty, a blank checkbook, then it's that you're spending that money wisely. And in most other cases, even at the very top of the sport, nobody has just infinite funds. It's how are you using that money and are you hitting and recruiting? So recruiting, to me, still is the lifeblood of the sport. And whether someone's crazy about the portal or very much so still ingrained in high school recruiting is how we're going to build our program. Recruiting's first, the money helps a lot. And once you've got those 2 things, you better be coaching well. And it helps if your facilities are nice too. So that's a roundabout cop out of the whole answer, but that is my order.
All right. He's Eli Lederman from ESPN.com. Eli, where can people find you, follow your work, kind of stay in touch with you? Give us some plugs on the stuff you're working on.
Yeah, well, you can find all my stuff and all my other colleagues on ESPN's college football team at ESPN.com. Simple enough. On Twitter by Eli Lederman, and on Instagram at ESPN Lederman. All over all the recruiting news in the summer. It's a busy time of year. And then once the train leaves the station on the college football season in August and September, I'll be all over that till January when we start all over again.
Awesome. Well, if you make it down to Orlando, make sure you look us up. We'd love to connect with you.
Most certainly will.
Eli Lederman from ESPN.com. Eli, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.